There's a joke in the brewing community that says, brewers don't make beer, yeast makes beer. And that is absolutely true. Yeast is a very important topic, and so that is what we're going to go over today. I will walk you through the science stuff, give you an overview of that, and then introduce you to a few of the options that we have available to us as home brewers. Creating the right environment for your yeast to thrive is really the trick to making fermentation work. It is also the key to reaching the style of beer that you were trying to make. Each of these are different versions of essentially what will turn wort into beer, but they're all gonna have a few nuances and differences, and we live in a time where we have access to all of these different kinds of yeasts, and we can really fine-tune a recipe by picking the right one and giving it the environment that it wants. As an example, if you were making a New England IPA and using a Kvik yeast, you can perfectly leave it inside your bucket fermenter or wherever in your 100-degree garage in the middle of summer, and it'll be happy as a clam. Whereas if you're making a lager, for example, you wouldn't want to do that because the esters and off flavors that come from that will ruin that beer. The key is giving the particular yeast the environment that it craves. Generally speaking, home brewers use either liquid or dry yeast. Here are some examples of the main companies that do it. This is a Belle Saison yeast. This is what I use in my cider making. It is made by a company called Lallemand. Safale. This is probably the most common yeast that you're gonna get in the home brewing kits. Almost all of the recipes say on More Beer or the other online retailers where you can buy a whole kit, this is likely the yeast that it's going to recommend if it is a general ale. So very safe go-to for starting out. Lalvin EC1118, this is a wine yeast. And then we move into the liquid yeasts. So these are imperial pouches. So essentially imperial yeast, they hone in that strain just like the other companies do too, but instead of dehydrating it and sending it in a pouch, they send it to you liquid. So we're gonna get more into the pitch rate and the actual nuances of these. But I just wanna show you, I wanna point out here that each of these come with their ideal temperatures. And so it's gonna give you the exact temperature that it recommends you use. So this particular one is between 60 and 72 degrees. The flocculation is high, which is how much protein it's gonna grab, or how many of the things are gonna fall out of solution essentially. And then it's attenuation. So that's basically its horsepower. And then we go all the way up into, say, more commercial pitches. This is what that would look like, a pound at a time for cider making. This will last me hundreds of batches of cider. So that's those. I will also talk about the technique of making a yeast starter at the end, and then I'm also gonna turn right around and teach you or tell you why I no longer do that and why it's unnecessary. All right, so let's get the sciencey stuff out of the way. The most basic definition of a yeast is that it is a single cell organism. It is a living organism that consumes sugar and needs oxygen, and then its byproducts during the fermentation are alcohol, CO2, and esters or flavors. What we are doing when we are pitching yeast into a wort is essentially taking a living organism and giving it the things that it needs. It comes back alive from its dormant state and starts multiplying and reproducing. Those cell walls actually divide, and so that's where the oxygen helps with that process. The nutrients that are in the wort are gonna assist with that, and ultimately it's the sugar that it is eating. It will continue to do that, creating CO2 and alcohol. That's actually how we get alcohol into beer, until it runs out of those ingredients. And then once it runs out of sugars to eat, it's basically gonna go dormant again and fall right down to the bottom of the fermenter. There are some yeast that is gonna stay in suspension, and so really that's kind of where that cloudy look comes from, say in a Hefeweizen, for example. But the majority of the time, we're looking for a clear beer, and so cold crashing assists with that. We can use some other things to make beer clear, but ultimately, the majority of that is gonna go dormant and fall to the bottom of the fermenter. So now we're gonna get even a little bit nerdier, but I promise we're gonna come back to practical right after this. So the main strains of yeast that we use in brewing are Saccharomyces cerevisiae and Saccharomyces pastoriensis. The main difference here is that one is an ale yeast and one is a lager yeast. There are plenty of subtypes and specific kinds of each of those, but those are the two main, I guess, motherships for the yeast types. Ale yeasts traditionally are brewed at a warmer temperature, so between 60 and 70 degrees, whereas lager yeast is what's called a bottom fermenting yeast, and essentially its activity happens lower in the middle of the fermenter at the bottom end, and it's going to prefer a colder temperature, so say in the 50s. There is plenty of research and testing being done that's debunking the thought that you can't make a good lager without using cold temperatures for fermentation, and like the guys over at Brewlosophy have done that. I personally have done warm fermented lagers very successfully, to where unless I told somebody, they wouldn't believe me. But so I guess the point is, when you're first starting out, just follow the instructions for the recipe, choose the exact kind of yeast that it does recommend, and follow the instructions from the manufacturer, and you're gonna be safe. When you have many batches under your belt, now's the time to say, take a recipe that you've brewed 5 times and you know exactly what that recipe tastes like. Now start to venture off and use a different kind of yeast, and that's gonna give you kind of a glimpse into how much impact the yeast actually has. Let's take a second and talk about temperature control. Like I was saying, giving the yeast the perfect environment for it to thrive in is kind of the key. So not only making a good wort, so doing our due diligence on sanitation and making sure that the ingredients are proper, we want to give a temperature control on the fermentation side. So that's one of the other keys to success for yeast. So like I've mentioned, there's different temperatures for different kinds of yeast. So once you figure out what that is, say for example, you want 68 degrees for an ale yeast, you could do that directly, just get that wort down to temperature, put it in your fermenter, and if your house is 68 to 70 degrees, only fluctuates 3 to 5 degrees throughout the day, you're perfectly fine. Pick the guest bedroom closet, or I've got a spare bathroom where nobody uses that shower. I just go put that bucket right in there, and it's perfectly happy fermenting there. When we go over the fermenter section of this, we're gonna go into depth about how to do temperature control with, say, either glycol or a refrigerator where you use a temperature controller. And essentially those are the different tips and things that we can do as home brewers to make sure that it is getting consistent temperature throughout its week or 2 weeks of fermentation. So just as a primer, the easiest version of this would be old refrigerator you get from Craigslist or wherever. You plug an Inkbird temperature controller or any temperature controller in it that has a 2 plugs that come out of it. So one is a heater and one is allows the refrigerator to come on. So and then there's also a temperature probe. You put that temperature probe on that fermenter, so as close to the beer or in a thermal well down inside the beer actually. If it rises 3 degrees, it's going to get power to the refrigerator so the refrigerator can turn on. If it goes below temperature, it activates the heat plug, and that would be just, there's either a heat wrap or a heat lamp inside the refrigerator, but that's the most basic, kind of common way that folks in the home brewing world control temperature. So the most typical way that home brewers get into temperature control is with a cheap refrigerator that they buy off of Craigslist. You can get a simple Inkbird or any temperature controller for that matter. I use Inkbird on my setup because I trust it. That temperature controller has 3 things coming off of it. It has a heater plug, a cooling plug, and a thermometer. The idea is this: you put that temperature probe on the beer on the outside of the fermenter or in a thermal well down inside that fermenter, so you know exactly, you're telling the Inkbird what that temperature is of the wort. If it gets too high, the Inkbird activates the plug that allows the refrigerator to come on, and if it gets too low, it'll activate either a heat wrap or a heat lamp inside the refrigerator. So essentially you're equalizing that temperature for the full week or 2 weeks of that fermentation. Basically, monitoring the fermentation temperature is what's going to hone in and pull out the esters that are unique to each individual kind of yeast. Those are things like banana or clove, fruity flavors, spices sometimes. And these are things that you generally want. If you're using that kind of yeast, you're going for a particular type of beer. So allowing it to do its thing is gonna give you those flavors that you want out of it. If you stress the yeast by going too high or too low, you can either stall your fermentation, or on the high end, you're gonna create some off flavors that are just gonna be unpleasant. You're basically not gonna get what you want out of it. And so that is why temperature control is so important. Now, I do wanna mention another category of yeast, and that is Britanomyces. And so, essentially, this is what we call Brett, and it is what leads to sour beers, like a lambic or a saison, and those take some more quality control. Essentially, what can happen is that yeast is going to get out into the air, into the brewery, into the nooks and crannies of your gear, and any normal ale or lager that you're gonna make from then on could get infected by that Brett. So typically breweries will have a separate building or a separate set of equipment to do sours on. I'm a huge fan of sours, so I'm not telling you don't do it, but I am telling you don't do it when you're first starting off. It's gonna take some more learning on the sanitation side, and it's gonna take some special gear. So we're gonna leave that alone for the course. If you wanna get into sours right away, you can look up recipes for kettle sours. Those you can do with your gear, because essentially you bring that wort up to a boil once it has soured, killing off the lactobacillus that gave you the sour flavor. Lastly, I want to mention propagating yeast and or reusing yeast. So first, this gear is one of those cool things that you can have when you are getting into home brewing and you start following the blogs and the videos, and you see this like fancy sciencey beaker, and it's going to be spinning, and there's basically a whirlpool inside. All this is a beaker where you are going to put specific amounts. So say for example, this would be a half a cup of dry malt extract, 1 liter of water, some yeast nutrient powder, so like a teaspoon of this. You're essentially creating a baby beer, so without the hops. So you would combine those things, let it boil for, or like simmer over the stove, directly over the fire for like 10 minutes, and that's gonna completely sanitize it. Drop this puppy into an ice bath and bring it down to pitching temperature. So you're back down into like, between 60 and 70 degrees is ideal. And now you essentially have an unhopped miniature beer. You would then take your dry yeast and put it in there, cover this up with, say, aluminum foil or a sponge topper or whatever it is, and this yeast is going to wake up and it's going to start multiplying. The idea being after 24 to 36 hours of multiplying inside this beaker, it's gonna be hot and ready to go when you pitch it into your beer. All this is a stir plate. So you would take this magnet and drop it inside the beaker, put it on here and just set it, and it's gonna stir. So you can absolutely get away with not using a stir plate. There's very much a case to be said that you can just kind of give it a swirl whenever you walk by throughout that day or two as that's propagating. The reason people do starters, one, I think it's a cool factor. It feels sciencey. It's the way that it's always been done in the home brewing world when they were building up from subpar yeast pitches. I just don't think that it's necessary anymore because, say, a pouch of Imperial, for example, is 200 billion cells of yeast. That is way more than enough for a 5-gallon batch. You are perfectly good. And if I wanted to just do a 10-gallon batch, I would just use 2 of these. It's so easy. I'm avoiding the risk of contamination. I don't have to clean this. Odds of boiling it over on your stove and making a mess and getting in trouble with your wife go up. It solves a lot of headaches, and I don't have to pre-plan that far ahead for my brew days because these just hang out in the refrigerator and they are ready for me when I'm ready to brew. So I get all my brewing ingredients ordered, or I go to the homebrew shop, get my grains, and then I get online and I get my yeast, and these ship in ice packs because they are alive. They're not dormant like the powdered yeast. So you just get them into the refrigerator and they're good to go. So it makes life a lot easier. Very last thing, there are several ways that you can reuse yeast. The primary one, if I were to make an IPA and I just want to reuse the same yeast, I would siphon that IPA off into my fermenter and then pitch the chilled wort from the next batch directly onto that yeast cake inside the fermenter. You can totally do that because it's basically yeast that's just getting reinvigorated by the sugars. Otherwise, there are fermenters that have ports on the bottom, like the catalyst fermenter, for example. I've used that quite a bit. You screw a mason jar onto the bottom. This is a big one, but they also have like little bitty mason jars. You can dump the original sediment and stuff, and then you're gonna get a layer in there that's just like this pillowy, creamy substance. That's your yeast. You can take this off, sanitize the lid, boom, pop this into the fridge, and it's ready for you. It does have shelf life limitations, but if you're trying to reuse yeast, you can do that. I will stick to my recommendation though. Follow the directions on the recipes that you're starting until you get your feet under you. Just buy new yeast. It's really not that expensive, ranging from like $4 to, I don't know, 12 or 15. It is a big part of the recipe's expense, but for $50, you're still gonna get 5 gallons of perfectly good craft beer. So, I know that gets kind of complicated. Keep it simple, follow the recipe, follow the instructions on the back of the yeast pack, and you're gonna be fine. Go down the rabbit trails that you want to, whether it's sours or yeast propagation, whatever those things are, once you've got your feet under you.